Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I am very pleased to stand and support the government's legislation. The reason this legislation is so important is really clear, because history will show that Labor's Mediscare campaign will actually be seen forever as a very deliberate, a dishonest and mostly a cruel hoax. And this really was aimed, unfortunately, and the part about that is such an issue is the fact that it was levelled directly at the most vulnerable people. That was the level of thought and care that Labor had for those people, that they would deliberately and dishonestly scare some of the most vulnerable Australians. There's a few things in this place that you don't go near, and that is one of them, that you would deliberately scare, dishonestly, the most vulnerable Australians. But that's exactly what Labor did. And now, what I saw in the chamber with the previous speaker and the member at the table was an absolute pride in Labor that they were able to do this. They're proud of it. And that's the bit that really concerns me most, because in this place, this federal house, we are here to protect the rights of the Australian people, the freedoms of the Australian people. That's what I thought we were all here for. Irrespective of what side of politics you sit on, I thought that was our number one job here. And I see that the most vulnerable people are those in this House that we are here also to represent most strongly. But to see Labor hold those very people with such disrespect and disregard that they would scare the most vulnerable in their homes by these robocalls is just appalling. It is absolutely no wonder that we cannot trust the Labor Party ever. And this was the clearest demonstration. If anybody out there is wondering where trust lies with Labor, this was the example of where trust does not lie. And in fact, this was just one of the most appalling things. I saw it through the eyes of the people who were being called, as I said, to target the most vulnerable, the elderly, those on lower incomes, and literally choose to scare them. How dreadful is that? How dreadful is that? And when you look at this is just a contempt by Labor for our democracy. And it's an anathema to everything that we, all of us, every single member of Parliament in this place, what we're here to represent. Every individual out there expects us to stand up for their basic freedoms and their rights, and they need to be able to trust us as members of Parliament that in this place, and when we represent ourselves out in the community, that we do so in a way that respects those rights. And that's what Labor compromised, and they're proud of it. I just remind every Australian, Labor is proud of scaring people and proud of this Mediscare campaign. And an election is defined as a formal and organised choice, a choice by a vote of a person for a political office or other position. Particularly important part of that definition is a person. It implies that a person has made up their own mind of free will, and their vote is their own to exercise as they see fit. That's the important part of our democracy. That's the important part. But when they're scared and when they're fed dishonest information and deliberately misled, that doesn't allow that fairness. It doesn't fit the fairness test at all. Now, I know in ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, the people themselves voted on legislation. It was a direct democracy. In modern times, this has obviously evolved as populations have grown to the electors choosing representatives to make decisions on their behalf. It's a representative democracy. However, when we take it back, the essence of democracy is still the integrity of that individual's vote. It's that very precious thing that people through the centuries have fought and died for. The freedom to cast a vote unhindered. It was why my mother's husband fought and died in New Guinea. I take that seriously. That right to the individual's vote. Clearly, Labor treats it with contempt. To scare vulnerable people. To scare vulnerable people. But people have the right to seek and receive information on who they should vote for. And over time, as political parties have evolved, they decide to try to persuade the people to vote for a candidate representing a particular party. In the early days, there were no rules on what could be said by parties or organisations about other candidates. So, clearly, the rules were put in place for a reason, so that those people whose precious vote matters could make the best decision for themselves, to make a clear decision. We see these ads on TV and on printed material, and we see those words said at the very end. They make sure that voters actually know the ads they see, whether it's on TV or in any other medium, who they were paid for by a political party or an entity like trade unions or GetUp, in order to persuade them to vote for a particular or relevant party or candidate. It's a very important part of our electoral law and the absolute protection that voters need. But this approach by Labor, the use of robocalls, targeting people on a basis of what was an outright lie, was just appalling. And these were made without authorisations, and they were deliberately deceptive. And that's why this legislation is so important. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters looked into this, and their terms of reference included all aspects of the federal election. They took evidence from political parties and made a number of recommendations to strengthen the legislation around the requirement for such authorisations. And this report is where this legislation has its roots. We are putting the committee's recommendations into law to protect democracy, to protect that precious vote and the right of the individual to make a clear and informed decision, and that is what we need to protect. I've read some of the comments made within the report. The Greens actually stated that they recognise the importance of voters being aware of the source of party, candidate and third-party communications. And they believed that the overarching requirement is that the voter who reads or views a communications is aware of who it comes from. Now, that's reasonable. The director of the Liberal Party gave evidence and said, well, you should be able to work out who is raising an issue with you and what they're saying. Gives an elector some notice, and they can make judgments about the same way they can with a TV ad, a radio ad, a mail piece or anything similar online that has money behind it. Again, a very reasonable position in line with this legislation. The Labor Party said in its submission, the purpose of authorisation is to allow electors to identify the person responsible for printing or broadcasting. However, they did add that they would be extremely concerned by any proposal to impose stricter regulations on any individual participant or class of participants in an election campaign, for example, GetUp, trade unions and stakeholder groups. In other words, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor wants to perpetuate the process of being able to provide misleading, deliberately misleading and dishonest information to voters. They want to continue to be able to misrepresent themselves and claim to be someone similar to Medicare. They want to scare vulnerable people yet again. And of course, what we saw was deliberately misleading information. It was a lack of truth, it was absolute deception, and it compromised the individual's targeted right to a free and fair election. But I note that even the Secretary of the ACTU, Sally McManus, even if we make this law, I just concerned about what Labor will do from here, because ACTU Secretary Sally McManus, when she talked about the law, said But when it's unjust, I don't think there's a problem about breaking it. So we could well see more of that, even with this law, that the unions and Labor could well see they're justified in breaking the law, that laws in Australia don't matter. They only matter if they think they're right or they believe in it. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. We'll just do whatever we want. Imagine if everybody in our community had that view and simply disregarded the laws that were inconvenient or didn't fit their particular agenda, as Labor does. But clearly, with Labor opposing this bill, this is a very sad day for democracy, because that's what this is about. It's simple. To be proud, as Labor has, and boast about undermining democracy, I find that just an absolute a scandal. It's a scandal. As I said, we in this place, and I tend to believe that people come here to represent their electorates. They come to represent very good people from all walks of life. And what we're here to do is to protect the very rights of those people in this place. That's what we're here to do as members of Parliament. And it just beggars belief that Labor would not support that right of the individual, their access to accurate information, so that they can make an informed decision, irrespective of which way that decision goes. And we all know in politics that there are continuous changes of government. But in those changes, what we do want to see is free and fair elections. We need to constantly and vigorously uphold the rights of the individual to that precious vote. And I was in Cambodia some years ago with the United Nations to observe the election. And of course we know the history of Cambodia. One of the things that has to happen is they need to dip their finger into indelible ink to prove that they've only voted once. And because they are a relatively new democracy, one of the greatest excitements of those people coming out of those election booths to talk to me with my UN piece on was to show me this finger to prove that they'd voted. They hadn't had the right to vote for so long, that they were so extraordinarily proud of the right to vote and the fact that they'd been able to have their say. Now, I tend to think that as Australians, at times, we take this right for granted. But I would say to every Australian, take this as your inherent responsibility and opportunity. Take this right to vote as something that we frequently around the world, our men and women of the Defence Forces, work diligently overseas and here. We send them out on deployments to protect the rights of the democracies in Australia. The fact that our greatest war grave is not in Australia shows that Australia takes up the fight for our freedoms and democracies and that of other countries around the world. And this is a very, very good reason. And it's one of the reasons I thought that we were all here, was protect those rights and those freedoms. And I see the freedom of having access to accurate information, not being deliberately misled, as a core part of the responsibilities of each one of us in this place. I take it seriously, the coalition members take it seriously, and clearly you cannot again trust Labor.